Welcome to Novelist Spotlight. This is Mike Consul, your host. In addition to being the host of this podcast and interviewing novelists, I am a novelist myself. I have 3 published novels. My latest is titled Lolita Firestone, a supernatural novel, and it is set in Sedona, Arizona and Cairo, Egypt. My previous novel is titled Family Recipes, a novel about Italian culture, Catholic guilt, and the culinary crime of the century. And my first novel is named Hardwood, a novel about college basketball and other games young men play. And that story deals with issues ranging from depression and racism to sex, religion, and university politics. All 3 novels are listed in the episode notes. I hope you will buy them, I hope you will read them, and I hope you will thoroughly enjoy them. Now, on with our program.
This is Mike Consul. Thank you for being here. Many years ago, back in the day, when I was much younger than I am now, I was an inveterate reader of a newspaper called New Times. That's in Phoenix. It's an alternative weekly. And I'm talking about the days when newspapers were very powerful, this was pre-internet, and the newspapers were a very romantic profession and they were very powerful. Today, alternative weeklies, if they still exist, are a shadow of what they used to be. At any rate, New Times was so big and powerful. It was a weekly newspaper, big and fat with advertising, and a great investigative reporting rag. There were names like Jana Boomersbach and Andy Zipser and Paul Rubin and Dewey Webb and others in that newspaper. And they would sweep the Arizona Journalism Awards against the Phoenix Gazette back in the day, and then the Arizona Republic later when they merged the Gazette into the Republic. And although the Arizona Republic was a much bigger newspaper, New Times was focused on investigative reporting. They attracted great reporters with their long-form narrative style of journalism. One of the people in fact, just to underscore the power of the newspaper at the time, it was founded by a guy named Mike Lacey and 2 guys, Mike Lacey and Jim Larkin, as a protest against the Vietnam War. Well, it turned into a cash cow like a lot of alternative weeklies, and they made so much money with that. They ended up buying other newspapers or starting other newspapers. They became the biggest newspaper chain, alternative newspaper chain in the United States, even buying the best known alternative weekly in the whole country. They bought the Village Voice. Now, this was after the Village Voice, I think, had started into decline because things were changing already. But Mike Lacey and Jim Larkin, Lacey being the editor, Larkin being the publisher, really built up quite a business. They're a tremendous business and fanned out. One of the names that appeared on the pages of New Times is a guy named Ray Ring, who is my guest today. And that's the first I had ever heard of Ray. And he wrote a lot of blockbuster pieces, won many journalism awards. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a minute. And one day I noticed that he had come out with a novel called Telluride Smile. And I thought, well, this is interesting. I better buy it and read it, which I did. Loved it. And it was a Henry Dyer novel. That was the protagonist and the narrator. And I read it. I actually contacted Ray at that time, told him how much I liked it. I wrote to him, told him how much I liked it. I was on the phone with him a little bit. I told him I had aspirations about being a novelist myself. And he told me a lot of, spent generous amount of time with me talking about how he prepared himself for writing the first novel that he had written, which involved a lot of regular old jobs, that including being a taxi driver and other such things, so that he garnered real world experience and could speak authentically in his authorial voice once he started writing fiction. So Telluride Smile was a smash hit for me. Really loved that book. Then he came out with a second one called Peregrine Dream, Peregrine as in Peregrine Falcon. And that one was a good book. It reminds me of the rock albums or the rock business. They say you have your whole life to write your first album, 6 months to write your second. Well, I don't think Ray was under pressure to turn out his second novel in 6 months, but it's a little bit of the sophomore jinx. It was a good book, but I felt like Telluride Smile was superior. And then later after that, as I was keeping an eye on his progress, he came out with Arizona Kiss. And this was a totally different sort of take. I mean, from my standpoint as a reader, he had taken on a different voice. It was more hardscrabble, more hard-boiled. And Henry Dyer was gone. He was no longer, unlike the first two novels, Peregrine Dream and Telluride Smile were Henry Dyer novels. He dispensed with Henry Dyer and came out with Arizona Kiss. Different voice, a different voice and a different attitude from my standpoint. But we'll talk to Ray about that. Then he disappeared. He disappeared from the scene. I didn't see another novel coming out. I didn't really have his contact information. I wasn't going to bother him about that, but I would look in. I've been receiving the New York Times book review for years. And I would look at, I think her name was Marilyn, or is Marilyn Stasio. She doesn't do that column anymore, but it was Marilyn Stasio on crime. And she'd write about the crime novels that were coming out. So I figured if Ray Ring writes another novel, it's going to be under the name, or it's going to be a crime novel, because that's really been his focus. These are crime novels. And obviously, because Henry Dyer is a detective and protagonist narrator on the scene. So you have that. And so months go by, years go by. Well, obviously months go by, but years go by and nothing. And I just kind of figured, but I knew Ray was out there and still working. So I knew he was alive and well. And, but was wondering, maybe he just got tired of writing. Maybe it wasn't the commercial success he had anticipated. But many years later, just this year, he has released a new book for the first one in, 20 years. We'll put this to Ray, called Montana Blues. He spent time in Montana. He moved up to Montana from Arizona. I think it was from Arizona. He's really mostly lived in the Southwest, but moved up to Montana. And this novel is set, obviously, in Montana, called Montana Blues. This one's not a crime novel. It doesn't have to do with the detective, but it does have to do with police investigation, white supremacy, race relations, and you name it. Again, we'll get into that a little bit more deeply here. The only other thing I want to say, though, about those first few novels is that he wrote under the name, I always knew him as Ray Ring. That was his byline in New Times and other newspapers, but he wrote it under the name Raymond H. Ring. And I thought, what a mistake. He's got this really cool staccato name. It's like a double barrel single, what am I thinking of? I'm thinking of a single syllable name. So Ray Ring is like, it's kind of a double barrel name there. And I thought Ray Ring's memorable. Raymond H. Ring, people, that initial is going to throw people, that middle initial. And I've noticed that the books have been reissued under the name Ray Ring. I'm glad to hear. And his latest one, right off the bat, under the name Ray Ring. How that came to be, I don't know, but we're going to find out, because again, he is my guest, and he is he's been a freelance journalist and a senior editor at the High Country News. He's been a correspondent for Outside Magazine and a columnist and investigative reporter for the Arizona Daily Star. He lives down in Tucson now, which is where the Arizona Daily Star operates. He's won 12 National Journalism Awards, including the George Polk Award for Political Reporting, a Mental Health American Media Award for an essay about his schizophrenic brother, John, who committed suicide, something we have in common. We'll talk about a little bit. I also have my oldest brother, Anthony, was diagnosed as schizophrenic, eventually committed suicide at age 27 when he couldn't quite make it through. And he even went undercover, and I'm sure that this fed into Montana Blues, went undercover posing as a convicted murderer in a maximum security prison where he got roughed up by a white supremacist prison gang. Very much what has come into play in Montana Blues. When you read it, you'll see. He attended 6 universities and earned a bachelor's degree in journalism at the University of Colorado Boulder in 1979. And in his 20s, getting back to what I was saying earlier, in his 20s, he held blue-collar jobs, including firefighter, taxi driver, the head of maintenance at the University of Colorado Mountain Research Station, getting all that experience that he wanted to eventually pour into his fiction writing. He and his longtime wife, Linda Platts, they live in Tucson. As I mentioned, that's Ray's home these days, where they enjoy hiking and the borderland culture and glimpses of bobcats in the yard and on the roof. How cool is that, seeing bobcats, assuming that they aren't hungry and looking for some human flesh. Ray Ring, with that, I got to tell you, Ray, probably the longest introduction I've done for anybody, and you're the only person I've had on the podcast who I've read everything they have written. So there you have it. Welcome to the program, Ray.
Thanks, Mike. I'm glad to be here. And yeah, that was, I don't know if I can live up to the introduction. I'll try.
I know you can. No problem at all. So, it was, this was a long time coming as well, because I had contacted you quite a while ago. You weren't quite ready to do the podcast. And we've never even met each other in person, although we've known each other for years. And I'm glad to finally get you on the program. First question I've got, though, is what about the long break from fiction writing? What happened? Was it just a matter of you couldn't get something published because you had ideas that weren't appetizing to the agent or the publisher, or did you just decide I'm done with that for a while?
I think it was Vladimir Putin who has prevented me from publishing another novel for all that time.
You drank some bad tea from Russia.
Yeah. I know you typically ask your guests how young we were when we got into writing fiction. And so I'm going to start there and go quickly up to the answer to your question. I knew in 5th grade that I was going to make a career, make a life in writing fiction. And I still have a couple of short stories I wrote back then with a fountain pen that read okay in my, the usual author's delusion, but it's persisted this long. But I bounced around in college during the Vietnam War years, transferred here and there, took years off, worked odd jobs, some of which you mentioned, thinking that I was gathering real world experiences in order to write fiction that was informed somehow, instead of fiction written by a 20-year-old or a 21-year-old. And I think that's a typical path for novelists, or it used to be. You typically read the author bio on the back of the novel, and merchant marine, turning a wrench, carpentry, whatever, it would be in there. A boxer. I think, did Louis L'Amour, was he a boxer for a while? Anyway.
I know that Norman Mailer was. I'm not sure about Louis L'Amour.
Was he? Oh, okay. Yeah. So I was gathering real world experience until age 29, when I realized that much of my life had passed and I wasn't succeeding in writing yet. And so it was time to put up or shut up. So I went to journalism school at age 29 and got out pretty quickly, because by that time I had enough credits for a master's degree with no degree. So I just took the journalism classes. And I started on the Denver Post, which was the end of an era. I wrote stories on a typewriter with 5 carbon copies and spiked them on nails on different editors' desks, all the copies. And in the back room, there were little old men setting hot lead type, actually melting the lead and reforming fresh letters and arranging the words on the newspaper page backwards and upside down. Quite a skill in order to print that newspaper. And then short story ended up on the Arizona Daily Star in Tucson, where I quickly earned my way into a position of some kind of independence, which is where I need to be. And I was a columnist and an investigative reporter. I tried to never write the same story twice or cover the same issue twice in my journalism career. And I managed to do that over 35 years, thinking, okay, I've covered that, now on to something else. And I did well in journalism. But I quit the Arizona Daily Star in order to finally get to my lifelong passion, writing fiction. And I wrote Telluride Smile, got an agent, one of the last of the old independent agents, Don Congdon, who was Ed Abbey's agent and Ray Bradbury's agent, et cetera, et cetera. And he sold that novel for $5,000. And Then I wrote Peregrine Dream, and Don sold it for $4,000. And so the trajectory wasn't good. And then I wrote Arizona Kiss, and Don declined to handle it. It was very, very dark novel. On first draft, my wife said somewhat jokingly, but not entirely jokingly, if you publish this novel, I'll divorce you.
I enjoyed the darkness of it. I mean, I did enjoy it, but go ahead.
Well, it's dedicated to James M. Cain, and that was my model. Postman Rings Twice and Double Indemnity. So it's a character, first-person character who is doomed, and he sets about creating his doom in the novel. And so I got a new agent to represent that novel. And in the process, wondering if I should risk that early in my novel writing career, should I risk changing agents? And I happened to talk to James Lee Burke about it. I had met him and corresponded with him, one of the great mystery writers going to.
Yeah.
And he said, quote unquote, I change agents like I change socks. So I thought, okay, well, I guess I'll try changing agents. And my new agent sold Arizona Kiss for 10 times what my other novels had sold for, and sold it to Hollywood, which paid more. And so that was the big financial success of my life has been Arizona Kiss.
Did that get made into a movie?
No, and my agent made a mistake on that contract. I learned something about contracts, which is the rights are gone. They're sold permanently. And what we should have had is a sentence in that contract saying, if you don't make a movie in X amount of years, the rights revert to the author. And put any number you want in there, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. I'm sure we could have negotiated something, and then the rights would have reverted back to me over time. But they're tied up now. I'm still in charge with the producer who bought them. I mean, I'm in touch with him occasionally, but nothing is progressing on that front. But I did get money out of it. And so for a couple years, I thought I've made it. I'm a successful full-time novelist, and this is going to be my life from now on. Should I pause for a minute?
No, go ahead. Let's go right through to this. There was Arizona Kiss, and then many years later comes Montana Blues. So
yeah,
I want to know about the intervening period as well.
Yeah, well, I wrote a couple novels that didn't work. They just live in manuscript form, and that's pretty typical for novelists. Most novelists have unpublished manuscripts under their beds or wherever. And that happened to me. And at the time, I had a wife and 2 young kids, and I needed income, and I needed consistent, steady income. So I went back to journalism, and I got a job I freelanced New Times and other places. And eventually I got a job that was perfect for me with High Country News, which is a very unusual, kind of unique magazine covering the American West and the national connections. And it's a 50-year-old nonprofit. So it's been nonprofit from the beginning, and probably the oldest nonprofit journalist operation. And long form magazine journalism. And
did you know Jim Bishop when you were there? Jim Bishop wrote for them as well. I don't know if that name ever.
I've heard the name, but I can't say I worked with him. So
he lived in Sedona, Arizona. So your paths may not have crossed, but that's how I'm aware of that publication. Anyway, go ahead.
So I quickly became senior editor. I was on staff for a while, moved to Colorado where it was located, and then quit because my wife didn't want to live in that town, and we moved to Montana. And we just didn't want to raise our kids in a desert city of 1 million people. We wanted to raise them somewhere else with more sense of adventure. So we ended up in Bozeman, Montana, which was an adventure. And we moved there with 2 young kids and no jobs. So that was kind of daring. And we made it work. And I worked remotely for High Country News then for 15 years or so, mostly as senior editor, where I was in charge of, I would write 4 long pieces a year, working on my own, and pieces in the range of 5,000 words on up. One I got published was 11,000 words. That's like, a sixth mystery novel as a magazine story. And my bosses were 600 miles away in Colorado, and I saw them once a year. I got it down to that. So I liked that job, and I made okay money for journalism. And we raised our kids, and then our kids went off in the college and their careers in different places. And that freed me up to come back to risk taking the big gamble on writing fiction.
So back to fiction at that point. Now, you had mentioned most journalists have these manuscripts under the bed or in a dusty drawer, and they could dust it off and, maybe recondition it to go out there. Is that what you did with Montana Blues, or was Montana Blues a completely virgin piece of work?
Well, yes and no. My first draft of this new novel, now called Montana Blues, the first draft was titled Against the Freeze, in the way that water flowing, there's a contest between flowing water in the winter and the temperature trying to freeze it. And that I did in 1997, and it was not successful, and I put it under the bed. But when I finally was ready to return to writing novels after my kids were launched, I thought, I'm going to do something with that. And I think of it as old-time cars used to have a hood ornament on the front. And I basically unscrewed the hood ornament, kept that, and drove a new car in underneath it and screwed the hood ornament back in.
Interesting analogy.
So the main character in the original version was a white ski bum who was wrongly convicted of rape and murder and sent to prison, and then gets freed by DNA evidence after 5 years in prison. And I turned it into a novel about a Black guy from the LA area who comes to Montana to play college football and gets framed for the murder of his girlfriend and sent to prison for 5 years and gets let out. And he's mad, and he wants to find out who framed him and who killed his girlfriend.
Yeah, you definitely updated it. I mean, it would not have had the themes that you have in there if it was 1979 again. But the whole thing with race relations, crooked cops. Of course, there was always crooked cops. We always knew about that. But then the white supremacists, and there's always been white supremacists. But you very much wrote a novel there that is contemporary in terms of its subject matter. And
yeah, that's what I aim to do.
Yeah.
And I tried to make it relevant. And it was a very interesting creative journey for me, or exercise, because my 3 previous successful novels, successful meaning they worked enough to be published by traditional publishers, were first person narrator. And I love that form. That's what I grew up reading. But this one is third person, and it's told from 2 points of view: the Black guy from LA, or the LA area, and a white rural Montana woman who makes her living on horseback eventually. So I wrote it from those 2 points of view, and then it's laden with flashbacks all the way through, which I didn't do in my first 3 novels. And the flashbacks are written in present tense, while the current time of the novel is written in past tense, the traditional voice.
Past tense, third person. And the fact that he was in prison we're not going to give anything away, so listeners can read the novel and figure it out as they go. But so this is no giveaway, but you've already said he goes to prison. Now, he does run into white supremacists in prison, and you spent some time undercover in prison. How did that, and we'll get back to Montana Blues too in your other writing, but how did you end up going to prison under what? Well, we know what pretext. You were supposedly a convicted murderer, but how was that all done? Was that in cooperation with a police department or with the prison administration? How'd that happen?
Mainly it happened because I was foolish, but the Arizona Daily Star decided to do a project investigating the state's prison system, because Arizona's prison system at that time, the early 1980s, was under a federal court order to improve its act, and things were really bad inside. So right away I said, well, I want to try to pose as an inmate and get inside a prison. And we had one other guy who wanted to pose as a guard, and that was part of the project. There were other normal stories, but those, the two undercover stories were the pillars. And at that time, a PhD kind of troubleshooter had been brought in to run Arizona's prison system, a guy named Ellis McDougall, who was a college prof teaching corrections, and they brought him in to fix the system. So it wasn't a typical head of the Department of Corrections. And we started courting him, saying, we want to do this. And really, it was a lose-lose proposition for him. I mean, if I wrote a story that said, from the inside, the prison system sucks, that's bad for him. And if I get killed, that's bad for him.
Yeah, for you. Yeah.
So we had this meeting finally. He'd been stringing us along for weeks, and my editor and I went up to his office in Phoenix on some floor of a skyscraper and met with him. And he started hemming and hawing. It looked like he had been kind of stringing us along. He didn't want to cross the newspaper, but he was really deciding he shouldn't do it. And I decided to make a play, and I stood up and, said, you've just been bullshitting us. I criticized him very briefly and not angrily, but I called him on it and basically called him a bullshitter, and turned and walked out of the office and walked down to the elevator. And I was hoping that would change his mind. It was a deliberate play by me. And then my editor came out of the room and came down to the elevator. And I said, well, he's either going to come out and walk down here and give us permission, or we're not going to do it. And sure enough, McDougall came out of the office and walked down and said, okay, because he didn't want to think of himself as a bullshitter.
Right. The gambit worked. You drew him out.
Yeah. And so the only three people knew I was a reporter undercover, and it was McDougall and his two right-hand men, one of which, Lloyd Bramlett, a guy who wore a white Stetson and carried a chrome revolver in his briefcase. Lloyd was head of I&I, Intelligence and Investigations, in the prison system, basically the FBI within the prison system. And he set me up with a fake identity. I was a convicted murderer, Raymond McAllister from Minnesota, being transferred into the Arizona system. And he put me in handcuffs and stuff. He trained me for a couple days and then put me in. Just nobody else knew I was a reporter, not the guards transporting me in the van to the prison, and not the prison guards, not the warden of the prison, because it would have been too dangerous. Information is a currency in prison. It's worth a lot.
Sure.
And if anybody in the prison knew, pretty soon more people would know, and that could be more dangerous for me. So I was really undercover, deep undercover.
Interesting. So how much of your experience there played into Montana Blues?
Well, I was roughed up by the Aryan Brotherhood, a prison-based gang that operates outside the walls too. And
Was that initiation, or did you do something that offended them?
Well, they have a racket, and every prison gang I've heard of has the same racket still today. They beat up people in prison and threaten to kill them, and sometimes kill them, to get the families to pay money to a bank account outside prison. And you cannot escape this kind of pressure when you're in prison with them.
Wow. So you had to set that up too. Did you end up getting the newspaper to say, okay, we'll send some money in just to cover you and complete the assignment?
I had the initial touch up, which is step one. They call it a touch up. And they had seen my wife come and visit me in the visitation room, and she had nice clothes on, and she brought me a little black and white TV and something else, I forget what. And that indicated I had a loved one outside the walls who had resources. So that's all they needed to see.
Wow. Okay, so very different than in the novel. Although I'm sure there's a lot of what you experienced in there that influenced the novel. Were you able to take notes at all? I mean, I suppose that would be dangerous if they got their hands on it. How did you do that? Just were you writing on paper, or did you have access to a computer and just had a way of wiring it?
No, I had 8x10 pads. And to start with, in the intake prison, everybody starts in one prison and they transfer you out to whatever prison they're putting you in. In the intake prison, I was in a cell with 5 other guys, so it was crowded. I had 8.5x11 pads, and I pretended to be writing a letter, letters. And so I would be writing, and in that letter would be stuff that would be my notes. So that's how I did it. And eventually when I was in max security, that's where I wanted to go. The prison I got transferred to, the old Alcatraz style prison. I hid my notes behind, I had a steel locker against the wall, and there was a little crack. And so I could slide my pad down there and leave it there when I left my cell. So I took a lot of notes, and the story I wrote was quite long, first person. Here I am in prison. So it was very powerful and got attention. And still today, there's a couple of stories that people who know my journal, people read over the years, that they'll come up to me and say, "You're the guy who wrote the story about going to prison, right?" Or they'll say, "You're the guy who wrote about his crazy brother," right? That's the other story people remember.
Well, and that's the kind of impact journalism that New Times used to do. And, there's still some publications around that do it, but so many just don't touch it anymore. They don't have the budget for it and so on. But interesting. So let me jump back for a minute. I had mentioned that your byline was Raymond H. Ring on your first few novels, at least at the time. Was that your decision? Was your agent or the publishing company saying that's what they wanted? They didn't want Ray Ring? Well, how did that come about?
Well, a different occasion of me being kind of a fool. When I went into journalism initially, I just used my initials, R.H. Ring, because I wanted to keep a low profile, and I just didn't want the attention. I've been writing for myself my whole life. I don't really write for the readers that much. And I think that's true for a lot of fiction writers. So I was just RH. And then when so the prison story was R.H. Ring.
Were you R.H. Ring at New Times? Or
no,
were you Ray? You were Ray Ring.
New Times was after the prison story.
Okay. So, and you were Ray Ring at that time?
Yes.
Okay, so I remember it correctly. I was thinking maybe I got it mixed up and, discovered your Ray Ring afterward and blah, blah, blah.
So I was only Raymond H. Ring for the first novel, and I don't remember how that happened, but it could have been, that's what the copyright of all these novels is. You're supposed to put your more formal name in and registering the copyright and put it on the copyright page. And somehow that turned into my the name on the cover of my novel. I can't recall how that
Well, all
happened.
three of them have Raymond H. Ring. I bought your novels right off the bat. So they were first printed anyway with Raymond H. Ring on the cover. And but I noticed they've been reissued under the name Ray Ring, and Montana Blues is under the name Ray Ring.
Yeah.
Clearly. In retrospect, what would you have done different then? Just said, hey, just
Ray
made sure that
Ring
they
from the beginning. I mean,
well,
hey?
yeah, but I mean, did they really did they not send you a proof or anything? Did you just kind of overlook that at the time and decide, okay, Raymond H. Ring, that's it?
Man, I'm getting my first novel published in hardback, my lifelong dream. And the people who were doing that particular year, it was smaller than the entrance class at Harvard, you know. It's a
I
big
get
deal
it.
to me.
You didn't want to question too much, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I get it. I get it. Well, these are good lessons for everybody who's listening. So the talk a little bit about, I want to get back to Montana Blues as well, but did I understand correctly? I think I did, based on what your wife told you about threatening to divorce you if you came out with a novel that dark, referring to Arizona Kiss. I definitely had a different tone and a different. It seemed like a different voice to it. It was clearly intentional then on your part, right? You were trying to do something different there.
Oh, absolutely. And that was the most fun to write too. For me, writing fiction, it's much harder than nonfiction, much harder than journalism. Because in journalism, you have a bunch of blocks to assemble, and those are your facts, and you're figuring out what points to make with your facts. And you're doing very difficult research often, if you do the kind of journalism I was doing. But basically, you're assembling when you get to the writing stage. And fiction, you have unlimited choices all the time. And other journalists...
Which is a burden, which is actually a burden, right? It's a burden. Because, I mean, what you're saying, and I had the same experience, was I thought how nice it would be just to be able to write and not, be able to really let your wild horses run free. Just go ahead and write without worrying about the fact you make up your own characters and your own situations until you go to do it. And you realize, as you're saying, how difficult it is. Even Tom Wolfe, Bonfire of the Vanities, Tom Wolfe said that when he first started writing fiction, he, despite how great a nonfiction writer he was, and how colorful he was and imaginative, when he went to write fiction, he said his mood plummeted. He ran into a situation that was completely foreign to him, where he was really struggling. Now, he turned out a great novel in Bonfire of the Vanities, and his subsequent novels were great, but I think a lot of people don't realize how much effort it takes to kind of break free or actually penetrate the fiction writing mentality.
Yeah, many people over the years have come up to me knowing that I had a novel out or several novels out and said, "Oh, I'm writing a novel too," and blah, 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 blah. And they don't seem to understand it's somewhat easy to write an unsuccessful novel, but to write a novel that is successful, and I don't mean commercial success, I mean that really satisfies, enough readers to be successful and satisfies the writer. It's so hard. I've lost my train of thought.
Well, I will say that just piggybacking on what you're saying, I tend to tell people, and I do this myself, that I've written a manuscript. It's not a novel, it's a manuscript, or I'm writing a manuscript. Until it gets published, whether it's self-publishing or through an agent, then it's not actually a novel, it's a manuscript. And it's one of the ways of just keeping things sober and keeping things transparent and so on. They're in for many of them anyway, unless they're extraordinarily gifted, are in for a wake-up call when they go to write it. It's tough stuff. It's difficult.
I did take a couple of grad school courses in, writing workshops to sort of test out, after I had a couple novels out, do I want to try to make a living as a college prof, get an MFA, go that route. And I did not want to go that route. I quickly learned. But in in my best workshop there at the University of Arizona, the teacher told us an old saying that if you internet it, you can find it attributed to one or two different famous writers from a century ago. But saying is, there are 3 rules for writing a novel. Unfortunately, nobody knows what they are.
Yeah, I've heard that one. It's isn't it the truth? That's the other thing is you can actually train a journalist, and there's a lot of just basic blocking and tackling, and then some more advanced techniques that will make a person a better reporter and writer. When it comes to fiction writing, it's so dependent on who you are as a creative mind. What works for you, what works for me, what works for somebody like Stephen King is not necessarily, likely won't work for somebody else. So you have to find your channel.
Yeah. You have to reach deep inside, and a lot of it is subconscious, because if you come at it fully conscious, it's harder. You can't say, I'm going to come up with a good idea right now.
Exactly. Yeah. You know, give it time, let it incubate. It might come out whole. It might not. You might need to change your thinking on it. What about what works for you? So talk about what works for you, because there's listeners out there who may say, I'm really glad he told me that because I hadn't thought of it that way, or I want to try that. What's your advice on writing fiction?
Well, I can start with something I think some of your other guests have said over the course of your podcasts, that I keep a pad on my nightstand every night. And I'm in the 35th or 40th year of that. And ideas come in the night and they go on that pad. And it could be a simple line of narration that if I don't write it down, I will never get it back. Or it could be dialogue. It could be a change in the storyline, whatever it is. And also walking and hiking are good for that, where you're engaged in a task physically, but your mind is loose to roam. So I think other fiction writers have told you things like that, and that's how it is for me. One question is, do you outline or not outline? How do you do your stories? And you've asked other guests that same question.
Mm-hmm. What is it for you?
Well, I've tried both ways, and I know which way works best for me. And this is the heavy lifting of novels for me and for other novelists I've talked with. The really heavy lifting is the plot. It's easy to write a scene. Oh, you go into a restaurant, this is what the waiter looks like. The drink feels cold in your hand. The glass is sweating with condensation on the outside. This is snappy dialogue. This is how she looks. This is how he looks. That's the easy stuff. The hard stuff is, what the heck happens?
And that's what most readers are riveted to, I guess. I mean, I will say that with Montana Blues, you seemed much more plot oriented, much more of a hard plot driving the story, and less about the ornamentation. So, was that your conscious effort you made?
It's not. I agree that it's not ornamented like that, but I do see it as a character-driven novel. I had to think of these characters and continually refine them as I wrote. Well, how would this character think about this or react? So
it is definitely character-driven.
Yeah. Instead of a first-person driven novel where it's all from one point of view, me, I have 2 points of view, and neither one is me. So that I see that as a form of maturity in a way that it took me a long time to come to. But plotting versus outline versus no outline. My first novel, I just kind of generally knew where I was going to start and where I was going to end, but how I was going to get there, I didn't really know. And so I did it that way. My second novel, Peregrine Dream, which you seem to like the least of my 4, I outlined the hell out of that novel, so that when I came to write chapter 12, I would open up the outline for chapter 12, and the outline would be 4 or 5 pages long, and it would have scenes in it that weren't written. They were notes, but yeah, the scene in the restaurant, and then the scene in the car, and here's some sample dialogue I could use.
Well, now wait a minute, because I can hear, people out there thinking you wrote the first one organically.
Yeah.
And you were paid $5,000 off the bat. The second one, you heavily plotted or heavily outlined, and that one wasn't as successful financially, or I think critically. So at that point, why did you not say, I did better writing organically than plotting or outlining?
I did. I gave up outlining.
Oh, you did? Okay, interesting. Okay, I jumped the gun here.
Though, then my new one might seem that way to you. No, I only knew where I was starting, which is the guy getting out of prison, and where I was going to end up. And the guy gets him, gets the bad guy. And how I get there, I don't know.
And so Arizona Kiss was also written organically.
Oh, yeah. And that was very different. I'll talk about that in a second, unless we run out of time. But
no, we got time.
What did you just ask? I just left my
Well, mind. I was saying why I assumed wrongly that you decided to plot all out. But then you're saying that you recognize that, and with Arizona Kiss, you went back to organic writing.
Yeah. And for the writer, for me, this writer, it's so much more fun, and the novel breathes so much better if you don't really know exactly what's going to happen, because then every time you sit down at your computer, it's really kind of a maximum creative effort. Instead of just filling in the blanks.
Or don't you think there's a middle ground where you can lightly outline and but within the confines that very light, it might be a one. In fact, I know a gal who said, I don't know if it was on the podcast or not, said, I'll come up with a phrase for the chapter or one sentence for the chapter, and that's my outline. And then, it's really organic writing at that point, but she knew where she was going, and she knew the steps to get there, but they were very amorphous.
Yes.
Very, I don't know if I'm using the proper term, but it was a very lightweight outline.
Yeah. And sometimes I'm in that territory and enjoying it too. As long as you don't have too much, as long as you're not overwhelmed by your architecture.
Exactly. That's a good way of putting it. The architecture can overwhelm the creative process there, and you feel constricted. Which is the last thing you want with fiction writing, is to feel constricted. It should be something that really does breathe.
Yeah, exactly. And let your characters do some steering. One thing I like to do is I get books about writers where each chapter is how this novelist writes, how that novelist writes, or famous sayings from novelists. Like, does this writer write in the morning? Does this writer write at midnight? Does this writer drink coffee, 87 cups of coffee, like we
listen to music or listen to silence?
Yeah. And the sayings by writers. And in terms of characters, there's a saying I like. I think it was Julio Cortázar, a Latin American short story writer. I could be wrong, but I think it was him who said, "My characters are my galley slaves," meaning if they breathe, it's because I tell them to inhale and exhale. And that's kind of counter to the conventional wisdom, which is, my characters, they just take over the novel and they run the novel.
Right.
Well, I think both things are true, sort of, but I don't have a lot of patience with people who say, my characters just take over, because in fact, you're still in charge.
Yeah. You're still going to screen them and whatnot. I worked with a gal who was a fiction writer, and she said her characters would come to her in her dreams. She would see them, and she was a very credible person, and so I believed her.
That's fine.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that they come to you in your dreams. It doesn't mean they were necessarily giving you a terrific copy, or that they were even really driving the story forward. But she obviously was wed to them in a way that they would. I actually should have talked to her more deeply about that, but it was, the deadline. She dropped the copy off. I was on deadline, all that kind of stuff. But there is a lot of stuff that goes on. People do make claims, I think, sometimes that are more made for the press release about the new novel rather than necessarily being all that true.
Yeah. But I'd come up with stuff in my dreams or in between dreams, and that's why I have the pad on the nightstand. So,
well, what about that big time period when you moved to Montana and you were not writing fiction? You were raising children, you were earning a living. Were you still writing fiction? You just were not writing fiction that you were putting into necessarily a book form or that you felt like was ready for prime time?
Good question. I always had it somewhere around as something I would be doing because it's the core of me. It's who I am. The journalism was paying the bills, and I did, pretty good journalism much of the time to win those national awards all on my own with no backup.
Right.
Just one guy in a one-person office.
Yeah, you weren't part of a team. You weren't at the New York Times with an investigative team that you're a part of. It was all you. So that had to be exacting work and taking a lot of time and energy.
And that required a fair amount of 50-hour weeks and 55-hour weeks. So at times I would, and every first draft of a major magazine article for me required an all-nighter where you're at your desk, it's 2 a.m, and okay, Ray, you've been working on this thing for 2 months. Here's your pile of notes. It's time to do it. So I didn't do a lot of fiction writing on the side during the crunch times, but other times I was always working. And sometimes I would be working half on novels, and sometimes I would be able to work 1/3 time on novels or half time, and sometimes very little, but I would still keep the flame going somehow.
Okay, so you kept it cooking. So you were it wasn't that you were not doing the thing that you love to do the most. It just wasn't getting out front. What about your writing regimen? Are you a morning writer? Are you evening writer? When you're in production mode, in other words, when you're working on I'm going to write this novel, I'm going to go out there and sell it. What's your writing methodology?
Yeah, when I didn't have journalism distracting me, I would get up and hit it. I'm a morning person, and there's something to be said for starting to write before you do anything else in the day, for me. But over time, I had to fill it in around the edges of my journalism. So I would write whenever I had time, sometimes late at night when the kids were in bed, which then makes the next day difficult, getting back to journalism. And now that I'm in my early 70s, I have it's less important to me. It's still one of the most important things in my life, but the magic of being alive after 70 some years on the planet takes up some of it's a very important thought for me to have going around as other friends get sick and die. Getting up in the morning and seeing the sunshine coming through the trees and looking at the birds in the yard and the flowers in the springtime. It's just the magic of this earth that was handed to us, the gift of life.
That is the truth. That is the truth. I remember that Richard Gere did a side-by-side. It was his birthday, and there he is today with his hair all gray and age in his face, and there he is young when he was the American Gigolo and all that. And he said, never be sad about getting old. It's a privilege denied to many. And that really stuck with me. It really is consistent with what you're saying, just that it's a privilege to be alive, to get to the stage of life where you're able to reflect.
Yeah. And a couple, my best friend who died a few years ago was having a conversation with and he was a heavy duty guy, a great career in journalism. And he was having lunch with a lawyer who'd had a great career and was retired. And suddenly their conversation came around to the line, yeah, what was that all about? And they were referring to their career. I just, reflecting back, what were all those 55-hour weeks about? What the hell were we doing? Well, we had to make a living. There was that.
Yes. When we talk about something like this, it's probably a good time to bring up your brother John, who was schizophrenic. And as I said at the top, I had the same experience with my brother, who the oldest member of a 7-sibling, or I have 6 siblings. He was the firstborn, and schizophrenia, was dogged with that. And by 27, he had just given up on hoping to rectify a situation. Well, you wrote a story about your brother and his situation is suicide, and won an award for it. Talk about your brother John and what the essence of your story was.
Well, he was my older brother. I have a younger brother too, and that's it for my family, for that part of my family. So, and he showed signs of schizophrenia, age 10 or 12, breaking everything in his room with a baseball bat. Around the time but my father got lung cancer from cigarettes and died. I was 12 and 13, and my older brother was 14 and 15. And I think my older brother kind of blamed himself for that. So that had something to do with the early onset of schizophrenia. Over time, over the decades, he tried everything. We never had a lot of money, so he had to rely on the public healthcare system for mental illness. And maybe it was that way for Anthony, your brother. I don't know.
Well, to some degree. I mean, my dad was a school teacher, always had a second job. He had 7 children. So there wasn't a lot of money for that. But my brother did find a way to go to New York City and work with Dr. Arthur Janoff, who was the author of The Primal Scream, which, you would think that, it's really been discredited since then. And it's really not the right treatment, maybe for anything, but there are people who said it's certainly not for schizophrenia. But he started showing signs of it in high school, late in high school, started getting stomach aches, distracted, hard to concentrate. But he was valedictorian of his class. He goes off to study computer science at Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, New Jersey. And the draft came along, and he decided to pick his branch of the service. So he ends up in the Air Force in Bitburg, Germany. Well, they had set in by then to the degree that he couldn't really deal with everything he had to deal with. And he went AWOL, and he had been reading Timothy Leary and the use of LSD as a mental health technique, or trying to rectify, emotional disturbances and all. So he experimented with that on his own. And because it's the only way to do it back then, that I knew of anyway. And it didn't work. And that's why and then he did try the primal scream therapy. That didn't work. They tried a couple of drugs on him. It made him groggy. He really didn't want to take drugs. And finally, he just gave up. He was in New York City, though, driving a taxi. He was functional to some degree. But it's a terrible thing, because it's a shocker when you get the word that it's over. How old was your brother, John, when he
was in his 40s, early 40s, when he wound it down. So he had a longer run than your brother, but he was less functional. He was very smart, but very ill too. He tried college a couple times. He did a stint in the Army, did well, tried to re-enlist, and they said, no, you're schizophrenic. We're not taking you. He'd had shock treatments, the old time shock treatments.
Mm-hmm.
He had a lot of heavy drugs. He had lots of counseling. We committed him several times for being a danger to self and others. He would get arrested for minor crimes, acting out at his apartment complex, whatever shitty apartment complex he was in, cockroach infested, the guy next door pulling a knife, police helicopters overhead. Because when you're schizophrenic and you don't have resources, it's really hard to find even a basic place to live, and get food and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a
He would get to
struggle.
give his money away. He got Social Security disability, veterans disability, little amounts of money per month. And people would rip him off. He'd just give people money. So he had
it's a struggle.
It's the worst, really, to me, schizophrenia.
Yeah, I'll tell you one quick story, and that's we went to a New York Mets game. My parents, my brother Jim and I, young, we were probably junior high school at the time. So we all go to the baseball game with my brother Anthony, and he's sitting there, and he started to imagine that every person in that stadium, and it was full. It was full. It was a big weekend. I might have been a doubleheader back when they had doubleheaders. And he thought every one of those 50,000 fans were staring at him. And he got up and told my father, I got to go. And my father quickly gathered us up and said, come on, let's go. And we followed him right out of the stadium. He couldn't find the car and dropped his binoculars and so on. It was one of those freakish experiences. And he got in the backseat of his car, had my father drive, and took his jacket and just put it over his face, just like hid right there in the backseat with his mother sitting next to him and one of his brothers on the other side of him. So it's an ugly disease, and it creates situations, these false situations for people where tremendous paranoia can set in. So it's rough stuff.
Yeah, that's how it was for my brother, hearing voices, seeing things in a cycle where you're on meds that are court ordered, and then as soon as the court order ends, you go off your meds, and within a week or two you crash, and then you're putting aluminum foil on your walls to block out the voice, try to block out the voices, and
there's that kind of stuff too. So I'm going to test your memory here. What was the headline on the story you wrote about John?
My crazy brother.
And what was the final sentence in the do you remember your ending sentence, your clincher?
I do. Let me think for a second. I end the long magazine story about him, talking about when we were kids. He was handy with tools, and a tornado came through, and he had built a clubhouse in our backyard, just wood framing and boards, and a tornado came through and picked that clubhouse up and strewn it around, the pieces around, 10 yards, 10 houses yards. And so John collected the boards, and he made a flat bottom boat out of that. And there was a swamp right behind our house, and so we would use that boat in the swamp.
And
John, I ended the story saying that was John's life. A tornado came through, and John made something from the wreckage.
Wow.
He was handed that disease.
That's a great clincher. Great and heartbreaking clincher, really. Wow. Well, listen, it's an emotional subject. We'll move on from there. Let me ask you about Tucson. You live in Tucson now. Now you moved to. We understand why you moved to Montana, because you had children. You wanted them to grow up in the great outdoors and with opportunities to, clean environment and all that. You've always been I think a desert person, right? So did you go back to Tucson because you wanted to return to the desert? That's your natural habitat? Or was there anything more to it?
A mix of reasons. The desert is a very powerful landscape, very different from anywhere else. And Montana is also a very powerful landscape, just different, completely different, but very powerful. Landscape is very much in your life, landscape and weather, if you live in Montana. So we came back because we liked the desert and we were tired. I shoveled my driveway by hand for most of our 20 years in Montana, and it wasn't a short driveway. And most of our old friends were here, and we like the cultural diversity here. We're 60 miles from the Mexican border, and in general, the Latino culture is very much a part of life in Tucson. And in Montana, one reason I put my Black character in Montana is because the census data shows it's the least Black state. It's not diverse. It literally has the lowest percentage of Black people of any state, including Wyoming and the Dakotas. I'm not sure how you manage that. And it has not much diversity otherwise, too. Latinos, Muslims, you're just not going to see that in Montana much. And here we have a lot going on. We're on the front lines of migrants crossing the border without documents, and hundreds of bodies are discovered in the desert around Tucson, no kidding, every year, and that's just the ones they find.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing the risk people will take, and that's always what America's been about, is risk takers. Those are the people who start companies, and they're willing to risk it all. It's just so sad that they feel like it's, they have to end up that way. At any rate, settle this question for me. Arizona Kiss, I've always, and I've tried to look up what it's a euphemism for, because I assumed it was a rattlesnake bite. Is that what it is? Is that what you meant? Going back to your third novel now.
It's a rattlesnake bite. It's also the kiss of this, the woman who lures the narrator into doom. It's that kiss too. So.
Okay, it's a great title. I love that title. I love Telluride Smile as a title as well. On the cover of Telluride Smile, you are called the Dashiell Hammett of the Roadside West by none other than Kinky Friedman, the Texas novelist and singer and humorist and former political candidate. I loved his campaign. He was so funny when he'd be interviewed by a journalist. Although he has very serious political beliefs, but he brings levity to pretty much everything he does. How did you relate to that? Here's Kinky Friedman calling you the Dashiell Hammett of the Roadside West. It's quite a comparison to one of the famous American crime novelists.
Well, I'm not sure what to think of Kinky Friedman, but I grew up reading Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler, and Ross MacDonald and John D. MacDonald. So we thought about naming our son Dash or Dashiell and didn't, but that was okay with me.
So, I don't feel like we've completed your writing regimen. You get up in the morning. Are you a word count guy? Are you a time guy, like 2 hours or 4 hours when you're really kicking it? What kind of commitment is there?
Yeah, no, definitely not a word count guy. I'm one of these writers, and you've had some on your show do it this way, some plunge all the way through a first draft and then double back. But I need to constantly go over what I did yesterday and last week, like before I move on. So, but I do, a good day for me is 6 hours maybe of work, and a not so good day would be 2 to 3 hours.
What's the difference between whether you're putting in 6 hours or 2 or 3?
Mainly other things on my to-do list, because I have ignored my family so much over the years to do my work.
But you 6 hours is a nice chunk of time. So you have this good stretch of time, and you feel like you've, along the way, I imagine that you feel like you've insinuated yourself deeper into the process.
Yes, it takes a while to sink in.
Yeah. So you're writing it during the first hour versus hours 5 or 6 are probably very different.
Yeah, although you get a little boost in the first hour because you're looking at your notes from the nightstand pad, and so that gives you something to go on to carry out. But then, it takes a while to really sink in. The level of concentration it takes, or I don't know if concentration is the right word, but focus, something like that, because you have to put yourself in this imaginary world and be in there as long as you're writing. And so when I was, often when I'm writing back in the my prime of writing novels, it'd be, okay, now it's time for Ray to go pick up the kids after school. So I get into my car and drive, across town and get there. And I realize I can't remember anything I drove past, any intersections I went through. Were those lights red or green? Jesus Christ, did I run some red lights? My head is still in the Grand Canyon, if that's where my novel is, or still in Montana on that frozen lake.
So you're still writing. You were still writing even as you were driving. I mean, I find driving to be very stimulative, walking to be stimulative, driving, just having passing imagery, even if you're not looking at the color of the lights, to where, ideas come more readily than sitting sedentary in a chair. So
I agree with you about that. Yes. And that's something, the writing life, when I was in 5th grade saying, this is what I'm going to do. Nobody ever told me, Ray, what that means is you'll be sitting at a desk 40 to 60 hours a week. Really?
It's like, it's just like
being too good.
No, I remember, a lot of people when I was growing up and we were all into rock and roll, people thought how cool it would be to be a disc jockey. And somebody had told me, people think that until they realize you're going to spend the rest of your life sitting alone in a room, listening to music by yourself. Yeah. And that's what it is with writing. As much as possible, I always try to be mobile or, about it, just whether it's driving and talking into a recorder, or walking and talking into a recorder, or at least pacing and then sitting down at the keyboard and machine gunning off a sentence or paragraph or a few paragraphs and then getting back up on my feet, that sort of thing. But everybody's different. Some people just work just sitting sedentary. I have to tell you that somebody listening would probably say, well, Console keeps talking about Telluride Smile, so I should probably start there and then maybe move to Montana Blues. But if you were asked that question, would you tell somebody start at the beginning, or would you say, I think you're best off reading my latest piece of work?
Oh, good question. Well, I always warn people about Arizona Kiss, because that for a long time has been my favorite novel that I've written, and it's very different than the others. But it's so dark. My mother didn't like it until it made me money. And then my mother and my wife liked it. But that was like tapping into the id. For me, when I wrote Arizona Kiss, it was the fastest novel I wrote. Often my fingers could not go fast enough on the keyboard. And I was thinking even faster than I could physically type. And Dick, it was, the words were coming out from somewhere. And I think that was successful in that novel.
Yeah, for sure. So what does that mean in terms of your next novel? Are you, here's Arizona Kiss, your favorite, and that it's dark and it's got a really very different voice than Montana Blues. So do you have a voice that you want to express? I've read enough of your stuff to know I hear 3 different voices. I think Telluride Smile and Peregrine Dream were one voice. Yes. And then Arizona Kiss was a departure from that. It was a completely different voice. It's been your favorite so far, it sounds like. And then Montana Blues, I see as a plot-driven, character-driven novel, and very spare. You don't the writing, you don't attempt to be as creative, I think, as in your past novels. You kind of let the raw scenes just kind of blaze on the page.
I think I agree with most of what you said. It is kind of spare like that. I think there are enough flashes to keep the readers I'm very much, I look at styles of novels, and it doesn't matter how good the reviews are. If I pick up a novel and the writing style doesn't appeal to me within the first few paragraphs or pages, that's it. I'm not reading that novel. I don't care how good the plot is. I don't care how good the characters are. It's the writer's voice that I look for. And I think most of my life, we've been in an era of voiceless novels, like the Harry Bosch series by Michael Connelly. He then walked across the room. Well, yeah, he did get across the room, but somebody put a then between the subject and the verb, and that's about as plotting as you could make that sentence. And that's typical for novels in my lifetime, in my genre anyway.
And best-selling novels, it seems. I mean, a lot of novels that are big sellers is kind of like, wow, this is really mundane.
Yeah.
And why do so many people? The thing that I've kind of settled on is that people really don't even assess the writing. It really has to do with, tell me the story, and I want to guess who did it. Or tell me a story. It could be a love story or whatever. But people they want something that's really easy to track and gives them some kind of emotional payoff at the end.
I agree totally with what you just said. Yeah.
So what's the next novel that you're going to write? Do you have something in the works?
Oh, yeah. I have 3 or 4 novels that have been on my to-do list for 10 to 15 years, and I have couple chapters, early chapters of each one, and a rough idea what I want to do. But I
know which one you're going to go to full development with?
Yeah, one of them I'm gonna, 1 or 2 of them I'm gonna get out there before I'm done. But I work more slowly now, and like I said, the other things are more important to me than they used to be. So if an old friend calls me up and I'm 2 hours into a writing day and says, "Hey, Ray, you want to go take a walk?" I'm much more likely to say, "Yeah, fuck it. I'm going to go take a walk." Oh, sorry. The heck with it.
Yeah. No, we speak the real language here. No, I get it. I understand. So do you know yet which of the Ray Ring voices is going to be employed for your next one?
Boy, I'm so tempted to go back to the first person rant that Arizona Kiss was, because that was so much fun and honest. It was very uncensored. But
did you have fun writing Telluride Smile? Because it reads like you enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot of wisecracks. That's the traditional wisecracking PI,
Well, and I love that you took us to Telluride. Okay, I loved being in Telluride. I've never been there, but I've heard such great things about it. That's definitely a place I want to go before I'm done. But being brought into Telluride in the mystery of it, of the case that Henry Dyer was looking to crack was very intriguing as well.
Yeah, I like that. I do like that novel, and I think of my novels, that probably has the most movie possibilities, because it's still relevant today. It has a Big Brother surveillance angle that was kind of new when I wrote it, but now no one would be surprised by it, other than the surprise that are engineered into the novel. But
yeah. So you're not sure. It sounds like you're not sure yet what voice you will adopt for the next one. I suppose it depends on which one you just decide, I'm going to go full bore with this one, and this is the first in the lineup that I'm going to write my 80,000 words on.
Well, one of my 4 to 5 possibilities. One is set in Baja, Mexico. One's set along the Arizona-Mexico border. One. Couple of them are set in the Grand Canyon, but 2 of them, I mean, one of them is either a Dracula novel or a zombie novel done for comic effect. And I have various reasons I might want to do that idea, because I think it might be more commercially appealing. I'm not going to give away anything else about it, but I think even the title alone that I have in mind, I think might help me get some attention.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the thing about
I'm going to write some novels. Who the heck knows what they're going to be?
Well, I would tell you this: the thread, the consistent thread that runs through all of your novels is that it really gives the reader a sense of place. It's
Yeah.
very much about a place.
Yes.
And whether it's Telluride or Peregrine Dream was that Tucson? I forget where it was set.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
It was Tucson. And then Arizona Kiss. I mean, you're in the Southwest, you're in the desert, there's the cactus, the cacti, and so on and so forth. And then in Montana, you definitely get the sense of the hard bite of a Montana winter. And well, I'll leave it at that. But
yeah, the place is very important to me. But I do, Elmore Leonard's 10 or 12, principles of writing these kinds of novels. Number one was, or one or two is, don't open with the weather and don't open with, landscape, basically. He didn't do that kind of stuff. You open an Elmore Leonard novel and you've got dialogue in the first paragraph and characters, bouncing.
Yeah. And, and I'm not the biggest reader of Elmore Leonard, although I've read some of his stuff. And I almost feel like there's too much dialogue, that it's, that it could use more expository writing, but the guy's famous for his dialogue. They say he writes dialogue. Somebody said it. He writes dialogue like he invented it. So interesting. But
I know
you're
less into dialogue than I am. I'm kind of between you and Elmore Leonard.
I would say that's true. Yeah, I would say that's true. It's interesting to read an example, Frederick Forsyth. It's interesting, not that I'm into his stuff a whole lot, but it's interesting to read a book where there's basically no dialogue at all. There's almost no quotation. He just tells the story. And every once in a while, somebody says something that's in quotation marks, and that's about it. But I do know that a lot of people like dialogue. They really love the dialogue part of it. And I do too, but I feel like dialogue is almost sort of thing that you want to make kind of precious, so that it has more impact. I feel that way about journalism too. With the Wall Street Journal, you can literally remember the quotes from an article because they use them very sparingly, and when you use them sparingly, you end up using your very best stuff in the quotations, and that makes them memorable. They tend to be more reaction type quotes or color type quotes. So, and I think that can be applied to book writing to some degree. I probably put more dialogue in what I write than I ever thought I would, but it depends, you do know that about me. So I appreciate that you've been a listener of the podcast for probably almost the beginning, I think. So
yeah.
Let me, I want to kind of come full circle, that sense of place. One of the things about New Times, where you used to write, that's one of the things that the Arizona Journalism Awards, you guys had won an award. I don't think it was you specifically. I think it was an overall newspaper award. But one of the judges had said that no, I think it was Mike Lacey's column. It was his column, and but this is true of New Times in general, at the time anyway, that you really got a sense of place, that you were in the Southwest, you were in Arizona, there was dry land around you, there was cactus, and so on. And I think a sense of place can be really powerful. It worked really well with New Times. I think it has worked well with the writing that you've done. So I don't agree with Elmore Leonard on, I don't know about starting off with the weather or the landscape, but I do think that sense of place is powerful. So I'm going to look forward to your next one. I hope you pick up the pace, Ray, and we don't have to wait 20 more years for the next one. Hopefully it'll only be 12 months.
Yeah, I plan to. There's one Elmore Leonard rule that I think we should all adhere to, and that is leave out the boring parts.
Exactly. And the question is, though, what's boring? That's where you have to be very discerning. And for some people, they think of what are you talking about? That's not boring. Well, it's such a hard judgment, especially now where there's just so much being published. If you're looking to get people to read, it's very difficult these days. So you got to make it interesting or meaningful in some way. Ray, it's been a pleasure having you on the program. It's been a long time. There's been a long lead up to this interview because you weren't quite prepared yet. You were still getting putting the finishing touches on Montana Blues. Now, is Montana Blues officially out? I think you sent me the galley version, but is it officially available on Amazon and all other major bookselling sites?
You can order it from any bookstore, and you can order it on Amazon, either way. Yeah.
There it is, Montana Blues by Ray Ring. Ray, great to finally get you on the program. Thank you for taking the time, and don't be a stranger, and definitely flag us when your next one is available.
Thanks a lot, Mike. I really enjoyed it, and I really admire your enterprise.